Hi, welcome to Week 1, Lecture 4 of GEOEL221 on igneous rocks. Today we're going to get into a bit more detail on igneous rocks. In previous lectures I talked about how there are two broad categories of igneous rocks, extrusive and intrusive. In the Kingston area, all igneous rocks are intrusive, so that will be more of the focus in this course. However, it's also important for your understanding to learn about extrusive igneous rocks, and both of these are covered in detail in the reading on cue. In this lecture, I'll show a lot of different examples of igneous rocks. In general, the more rocks you see, the better you become at being a geologist or a geological engineer. So by seeing many different examples, you'll get a better sense of appreciating the characteristics of these rock types as well as the variability between them that can exist between different localities and different ages. To start off, we've got at the top here volcanic ash and pumice, examples of extrusive rocks. In the middle section of this slide, we have them divided by mafic rocks and felsic rocks. So mafic being dark colored and felsic being light colored. And on the mafic side for extrusive, we have basalts, and the intrusive corresponding rock is gabbro. And basalt and gabbro are similar in their chemical compositions, but different in grain size because of their environment of formation. On the felsic side, we have rhyolite as the extrusive rock, and that corresponds to more of a granite on the intrusive side. And in some cases you have porphyry rocks, which have a lot of phenocrysts, which are larger crystals within a finer grained matrix. And this is a bit of both in terms of slow rates of cooling to allow the larger phenocryst crystals to grow, combined with faster rates of cooling, such as what you would find in an extrusive environment, that would result in the finer grained ground mass. In this lecture, we'll talk about a variety of igneous rock formations, and this diagram gives an idea of their relative senses of scale. So both on the left photo and in diagram A, looking at a dike and a sill, these are on the meter scale. And the photo on the left is a example of the syenite dike, which is quite common in the Kingston area, and you'll see this in the field later on in the course. Looking at the diagram B and C, we're getting into the laccolith and lopalith scales at the kilometer to a handful of kilometers. And finally, the largest scale feature you'd get for an intrusive igneous rock are combinations of stocks and plutons into batholiths, and those can be on the tens of kilometers of scale. This diagram shows the development of intrusive igneous rocks over time and how different erosional surfaces over time will reveal different sections of the developments of igneous rocks. So in time 1, we can see on the top right, we have the formation of multiple plutons into a batholithic structure far underground with 2 active magma chambers. You'll note that the heat from the intruding plutons is transferring heat from the intrusion into the wall rock to bake the pre-existing rocks, and that's a common feature, as we've already discussed, for an intrusive contact. Still in time 1, as the magma chambers are feeding volcanoes and a laccolith as well. As we move from time 1 to time 2, so onto the right side of the diagram, the volcanic activity has stopped, leaving behind the dike and laccolith, as well as the lava plateau that is a remnant of the lava flows that were occurring in time 1. With further erosion as we move through into time 3, these dike and sill features and the lava plateau get eroded. The older country rock is eroded down, and what we're left with seeing are the tops of the plutons, or the batholith, And in between those tops, in some cases, you can see small areas of the original older country rock. Here's some field examples of intrusive and extrusive igneous rock development. So on the top right, we have pyroclastic layers. Pyroclastic, if you remember from your reading on chapter on igneous rocks, that is from the settlement of an ash cloud from a pyroclastic volcanic event where the ash cloud would have settled, leaving fragments of rock and dust to lithify. And on top of those pyroclastic layers, on the top right, we have the lava flow, which would have been lava coming out of the volcano and flowing over the layers of ash. The example on the bottom right is an intrusive igneous style, so you can see a black dike cutting up through more of the pinkish granitoid country rock. We saw this example of the Sierra Nevada batholith in previous lectures. This is Half Dome in Yosemite Park in the US, and this is a famous example of a batholith in North America. And there's some more information on this, and there's many more field examples in the chapter reading on igneous rocks. So looking at some of the major features and stocks in batholiths, now I'll talk about each of these in a bit more detail. These are all mappable features that we can observe in the field and use to develop our geological models and interpretations of the geological history and setting. So we have intrusive margins or contacts, multi-phase intrusions, xenoliths or enclaves, roof pendants, and igneous fabrics. So intrusive margins and contacts, this is the same as the contact between a newly formed pluton or batholith into country rock on a large scale, as well as on a smaller scale, the intrusion of dikes and sills, like the example shown here. When magma comes in contact with the country rock, it cools faster at its margins, and these are known as chilled margins, and the cooling progresses toward the interior of the intrusion from there. Rapid cooling on the edges compared to a slower cooling in the center results in changes in textures, structures, and mineral composition through the cross-section of the intrusion. Multi-phase intrusions can be a bit more complicated. This is where magma chambers evolve and often produce a series of distinctive rock types, and they evolve by partially melting wall rock around new magma chambers and incorporates that wall rock into the magma, forming a new mixture of magma composition and assimilating the composition altogether, and then subsequently allowing new rocks to be formed during the magma upwelling, intrusion, and lithification. So depending on the scale of field mapping, either you want to group these complicated types of intrusions into one unit and run away as fast as you can, or if it's at a more detailed scale, map all of these features in detail. So some of these examples are shown on the right side of the slide, where you can see distinctly two phases of magma. There's a salt and peppery blocks surrounded by a light pink bands. Next is xenoliths, or also known as enclaves. There are many examples of this in the Kingston area. So on the left side is one example of a diopside gneiss being cut by a syenite dike, and a xenolith of the diopside gneiss is entrapped or surrounded by the syenite dike. And xenolith, the term, really means foreign rock. The example on the right is from West Cornwall, where there's a xenolith of slate from the original country rock that's surrounded by granite. The mechanism of emplacement for xenoliths is known as stoping. So in this case, you can see a diagram illustrating stoping on the right side of the screen. Stoping occurs when magma creeps up by upwelling and fragments the overlying rocks and continues to creep up from there. And as the overlying rocks get fragmented, they get incorporated into the magma body and transported with it until the magma cools. Roof pendants are a neat feature that are from near the top of the plutonic intrusion or batholith. They're shaped somewhat like large xenoliths in outcrop. Like the photo example on the right, you can see some people highlighted there for scale. In this case, again from Cornwall, the dark colored rock, which is the roof pendant, is the slate, which is the original country rock. And then the slate roof pendant is surrounded by the younger intrusion of a granite, which is the lighter beige colored rock. So when you're in the field and you're walking across an intrusive body and you come across what seems like country rock or pre-existing rock types that are older, maybe you have reached the other side of the intrusion, or you may have stumbled upon a roof pendant. A three-dimensional diagram showing what the roof pendants look like is shown on the bottom left of the slide. On geological maps, you can also see how roof pendants are interpreted. The map on the left is from the Kingston area, and you can see in the pink is the plutonic rock. The dark and light blues are the older rocks that in some cases are preserved within the pluton itself. And so these are examples of local roof pendants. In the example on the right, we have the Thor granodiorite in white, and you can see within that unit there are xenoliths and roof pendants of the older units that are preserved. Roof pendants can form simply through erosion, and depending on where the erosional processes are with respect to time, they may be in their original place with respect to the geometry of the intrusive body. However, there's an alternate mechanism of emplacement, which is called subsidence. In this case here, we actually see sections of the overlying country rock falling down into the pluton. This can be a result of faulting. A large-scale example are caldera systems, and you'll learn more about caldera systems in the chapter posted on OnQ. And this is a similar use of the term subsidence as you would find in a mining context, which you will learn about in other courses. Finally, we have igneous fabrics, and these are not metamorphic. We'll talk quite a lot about fabrics, and I've already mentioned foliations and metamorphic rocks, but planar structures can also occur in igneous and sedimentary rock types. So these ones here are not metamorphic. They're formed during the formation of the rock. And these are very useful for geological mapping because we can measure the orientation of the fabric to then help us draw contacts between geological units on a map. So it helps effectively to constrain our geological model of, in this case, how big is the pluton and what is the location of the pluton. Igneous fabrics form depending on pressure, temperature, strain rate, and rock composition at the time of formation. You can have these expressed in a few different ways. So on the brittle side of things, this happens at a low temperature, and this would be the same shearing process as faults, like the example shown on the bottom left photo. As you increase pressure and temperature, you get into more of a ductile region of behavior. So the photos on the right side show examples of ductile shear zones that occurred in the rocks, and you can see the movement indicated by the arrows and the resulting shear plane preserved. And so these are features that we can measure in the field and look at their orientations in particular. So how do these igneous fabrics get there? And this mechanism of emplacement is known as diapiric intrusion. This is an intrusion of magma that would fill in from the center and inflate, just like a balloon, and flatten the earlier phases near the outer contact of the intrusion. So you can see the examples on the bottom left photograph, as well as is represented by the black flattened dots in the diagram on the right. You can see those xenolith examples that are preferentially aligned near the contact of the intrusion. So moving on to igneous rock identification, we've talked about sort of the geometries we can see. We've looked at general rock names for examples of extrusive igneous rocks and intrusive igneous rocks. But now let's get a bit more specific and toward how we'll be naming rocks when we get to the field. First, let's talk about texture. We've used the terms fine-grained and coarse-grained to describe extrusive rocks and intrusive rocks, respectively. More formal terms in geology for these textures are aphanitic for very fine-grained rocks and phaneritic for coarse-grained rocks that have visible crystals. When we get into microscopic textures, here are some examples of granite on the left, a tuff in the middle, and an obsidian on the right. Going from the hand sample scale that we're familiar with now on the bottom to microscopic scale with thin sections and a microscope, we can describe these textures as crystalline for the granite, fragmental for the tuff, and glassy for the obsidian. Here are two diagrams that illustrate the classification of common igneous rocks. They basically are saying the same thing. I've added the one on the left to show more examples of each general rock type, but we'll focus on the diagram on the right side of the slide. The graph on the top shows the percent composition of minerals, approximately, that fall into each category of felsic, intermediate, mafic, and ultramafic rocks. Below the graph, you can see examples of each of these rock types, generally speaking. On the intrusive side, we have felsic granite, intermediate is diorite, gabbro is mafic, and peridotite is ultramafic. And on the extrusive side, you can see rhyolite, andesite, basalt, and komatiite. In general, with this diagram, as we move toward the felsic rocks, we have silica content increasing. We have sodium and potassium content increasing. We have a reduction of iron, magnesium, and calcium, and the temperature at which melting starts decreases, and that corresponds to the relatively high amount of silica that's present in these rocks. So if we're to go about identifying these igneous rocks in the field, and again we'll focus on the intrusive rocks, we have to be able to identify the following minerals: potassium feldspar, quartz, plagioclase feldspar, muscovite and biotite mica, amphibole, and pyroxene. Olivine is not present in the Kingston area, so we don't have to worry too much about that, but you will learn about olivine in more detail in other courses. So here are examples of the primary minerals that we see in igneous rocks. And primary is referring to minerals that originally crystallized from the magma when the rock formed. Quartz is in the top left, potassium feldspar and plagioclase feldspar. We have amphibole, pyroxene, and biotite. I encourage you to spend some time on this slide to look at these examples and familiarize yourself with what these minerals look like. We'll talk more about how to more formally describe their characteristics as we go through this course. In order to formally name a rock, we need to identify the percentage of minerals that are present in each rock type. This is a very helpful diagram to get used to what 1% of a rock looks like, or what area does 50% look like, and so on. Generally, the human eye is not very good at identifying percent composition, especially in the lower ranges, less than, say, 20%. So again, please spend some time looking at this diagram to familiarize yourself and train your eyes to understand what these different percentages would actually look like. When we're looking at rocks in the field, weathering becomes a very important feature to consider. Since we're looking at rocks at ground surface, they are being and have been exposed to surface weathering, whether it be from wind, rain, snow and ice, and sunlight. And with these weathering processes, we get fresh surfaces and weathered surfaces of rocks. And when you look at both of these surfaces, they may reveal differences in textures and mineralogy to help with the rock identification and evaluating the percentage mineral composition of the rocks. In terms of mineralogy, different minerals weather at different rates. So in this case, the potassium feldspar, or K-spar for short, you can see our larger crystals that are more resistant to weathering and are standing up a bit more from the surface. We can see plagioclase also is present, and that's weathering at a little bit more of a higher rate, so the minerals are not standing out as much as the potassium feldspar. And the colors are a bit different. So the potassium feldspar in this case has a little pinkish tinge to it, whereas the plagioclase is more of an off-white. And we can also see the clear, whitish, grayish quartz crystals that are present in the rock. This is the IUGS classification of phaneritic igneous rocks, which is also known as the QAPF diagram. This diagram is what we'll use to identify root names of rocks in the field, and the Q, A, P, and F stand for quartz, alkali feldspar, plagioclase feldspar, and feldspathoid. When we're looking at the diagram, the common rocks are in the top triangle, or ternary diagram is what this is called. The rare rocks get into the feldspathoids, essentially rocks that are lacking in quartz, and we won't see any of these, and so we don't need to worry about that side of the diagram. So in this course, we'll focus on the top part of the diagram. For field names, which is what we'll be using in this course, we use systems based on observable features, such as this classification scheme, and the mineral components are given by their percentages or ratios, where the base minerals of quartz, plagioclase, and alkali feldspar plot where the percentage of the mineral components of quartz, plagioclase, and alkali feldspar give you the root name somewhere on this diagram, such as granite, granodiorite, or syenite, or others. And then by looking at the micas and mafic minerals that may also be present in the rocks, we come up with the full field name that would be recorded in your field book and reported by your field site investigation. So how do we go from the root name to adding in these other minerals? This is a good reference slide for you. So we start based on the base name, such as granite, and the minerals that are not end members of the QAPF diagram modify the base name. If you have biotite, for example, in a granite, you would name it a biotite granite. And the relative importance or the relative amount of the mafic mineral is indicated whether it is less than 5% of the rock composition or more than 5% of the rock. If the percent of a mafic mineral is less than 5%, the word bearing is added to the mineral name. So if you have a granite with less than 5% biotite, you would have a biotite-bearing granite. Here are some more examples of basalts, gabbros, diabases, and diorites that have quite a few more mafic minerals. A note on naming: if it's fine-grained, such as a diabase that you may see in the Kingston area, and there are phenocrysts in the rock, you would name them as the mineral composition of the phenocryst combined with ferric, and then the general name such as diabase. So the example given at the bottom of the slide is plagioclasic ferric diabase. Here are some more examples of granitoids rocks. There's a granite on the left of this slide, and looking at the half-dome granodiorite on the right side, we can see it contains quartz, plagioclase feldspar with some potassium feldspar, and the mafic minerals are hornblende, which is a type of amphibole, and biotite. So if we were to name this granodiorite specifically, and the hornblende and biotite are both more than 5% of the total rock composition, this granodiorite, we would name it as a hornblende biotite granodiorite. There are frequently secondary alteration minerals that are present in these igneous rocks, certainly in the Kingston area, which we'll see. These minerals form from alteration of the rocks after their initial formation from the magma. So mafic minerals typically alter to chlorite, which is indicated by the arrow on the left as the dark greenish colored mineral, and magnetite is magnetic, and both of these are identifiable in the field. Plagioclase frequently alters to epidote, which is indicated in the photo on the right, which is a pistachio green and colored and soft mineral. It also alters to calcite. Here are some examples of more exotic intrusive rocks that you may come across in your career. We have kimberlite, which is associated with diamond ore. These rocks originate from deep within the earth and intrude in a pipe-like structure into the crust. And depending on the temperature profile of where the rocks originated from in the mantle, they may or may not contain diamonds. Lamprophyres are another rare type of intrusive rock. These are small volume rocks that occur more so in dikes or sills, and they contain biotite and amphibole, but distinctively lack feldspar. So that's all for today on igneous rocks, and thanks for watching. Please add your comments and questions from this lecture to the lecture Q&A Google Doc posted on OnQ. Make sure you finish the practice or exercise on age relationships and start to read Chapter 6 on sedimentation and sedimentary rocks, which is posted on OnQ. If you'd like to read ahead, have a look at Chapter 7 on metamorphism and metamorphic rocks. Thanks. Bye.